Well, hey guys, welcome into the Next Man Up podcast. I'm Mark, he's John, and we're both honored to be with you for another episode today. Hey, if you got any suggestions, feedback, questions, we'd love to hear from you. You can get us at feedback@thenextmanup.com. If this is the first time you're joining us, welcome. If you haven't checked out our website before, you can hit thenextmanup.com and see what we're all about there. However, wherever you prefer to engage with us, we encourage you and look forward to you doing so. And thank you for being a part of the community that is about being and raising healthy and godly men. John, I don't know if this constitutes being triggered. It's like that's a phrase that could mean a bunch of different things, right?
Yeah.
But I will admit that I got a little amped up the other day reading a Facebook post. Now I know, boy, that would never happen on Facebook, right? So I'm a part of a handful of different men's groups, father groups, that type of thing. And I'm just it's a way for me to see what the conversations are about and to kind of keep a finger on the pulse of what's out there.
Sure.
And I'm mostly reading and watching. I seldom participate. But what I've noticed with one group in particular, which shall remain nameless, is there's this tendency toward debating issues. And the issues tend to be more like things that people can build a black and white perspective around. And so I know when I go to this group, I'm going to get a bunch of social media type discourse around an issue that is sometimes just completely missing the bigger picture, missing the real issue. So I get an alert of a post, I see the post, and once again, it's an example of this issue that has become an issue. And boy, I got fired up reading some of the comments. And it was really a handful of guys just going back and forth, at least the other day when I was looking at it. There may be more comments out there today. But here was the initial statement that started the discussion. And of course, no context. I don't know who the poster was. I don't know who what he was trying to get out of this. I really have nothing but the text. The text says this: men, love makes requests, not demands. If your wife doesn't fulfill your requests, it doesn't mean she doesn't love you or that she is being biblically disobedient. So I read that and I'm like, okay, I see there's some comments and discussion. I'm just going to see what's in the discussion. And one of the first comments I read is, she's being disobedient to God and to her husband. And I'm like, oh my gosh, really, are we having this conversation as men and as husbands in the Christian context? Are we really having this conversation today? And I'm telling you, man, it got me really, really fired up. Now, one post, a small sample size, but there's a pattern here that I've seen within this group and within others of, I can't even call it debating, posting on these issues, your opinion, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And of course, social media, doesn't matter which platform, social media is not a good platform for discourse and discussion. I'm on a rant here, right? I'm going. But as I was reading through the comments back and forth, it was just more of this essentially, you're wrong. No, you're wrong. No, you're wrong. No, you're wrong. And the topic happened to be this topic about how we think about husbands in relation to wives, and really how we're interpreting the Old Testament from that culture, or more specifically, what Paul writes to the Ephesians in chapter 5. And like, man, I really got really got fired up because I felt like it was just completely missing the bigger picture here. Like one single verse, wives submit to your husbands, that has been used to abuse so many for so long, and it doesn't have to be that way. And as I was thinking about coming into this conversation, we did an episode not too long ago about anger and white men and the dislocation that men are feeling, and that concern about, well, what happens if I lose my authority and my power and my entitlement, if you will. So some of that is in play here with respect to this issue. We talked last episode, I believe it was, around interpreting a document about how to be a gentleman that's 140 years old with the cultural lens of what was going on 140 years ago, not our cultural lens today. I think all of that can come to bear on this topic here. And part of me, my last thought, and then I'll take a breath. Part of me doesn't want to talk about this, and yet I feel like we have to talk about it because we're still talking about it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm glad you acknowledged you needed a breath, because I was going to tell everybody, let's just pause and breathe, You're exactly right, in my opinion. There's a bunch of reasons why I have that opinion. Is this nationwide? Is this throughout the entire church? No, it's not. But it is still there enough that the topic does need to be discussed. And do we have to be on the black or white side of it? No, we're not here. Correct me if I'm wrong, Mark. But our objective today is not to say the black or the white side is the right side. That's not our objective today. Our objective is to hopefully give a couple of things, but to give you as a husband some encouragement about this conversation under your roof. And what does this mean under your roof? And when you are engaging other husbands, how to do that better. Is that right?
Yeah, and I would also add, John, I want to encourage men to have a better conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Instead of arguing black and white over this issue, what if we zoom out and saw it in a different context, and we led in our lives and in our homes, not from the position of authority, but from the position and the perspective of love. And what does love look like? So like that, I want to, like, there's a better way to engage this topic, to engage this idea, and we can do it in a way that looks more like how Jesus showed us, rather than how we've taken our own interpretation of words and meaning from our culture, not understanding the culture 2,000 years ago, and we've used them in a way that is not beneficial, loving, uplifting, serving for the good of others. We've used it in a very selfish way.
So let me just go ahead and say this, because it's going to come out sooner or later in this conversation. So it might as well come out now. If I were to point a finger in one direction or another to say this is sort of where the conversation starts, it starts from the pulpit. Where did we hear this? Where did we first receive it and decide, which side we're on about it?
Mm-hmm.
That's where we first heard it.
Mm-hmm.
And for audience reminder, just a reminder here, I'm not married, so I don't have to have this conversation under my roof, but I would be interested if I could take a poll of all the dads, either that were on that Facebook post or just to the church in general. How many of you have actually had a conversation with your wife with no one else in the room? And when I say no one else in the room, we're not talking about what Pastor so-and-so said. We're not talking about what my mom and dad said.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about what you and I we're the only two having this conversation. And if we don't really feel like we have truly our own convictions about this, we're going to work on that together. Man, I think it would totally change the conversation.
I remember early in my marriage having a chat with Kristen on what happens when we're at an impasse with a decision that needs to be made.
Nice.
And I'm, before you give me props, I remember saying, well, the Bible says that the husband is the head of the household.
Okay.
But John, I remember saying that with confusion and without conviction. It's like I've heard this, but it was dissonance for me in that moment because it just didn't feel right. And I can honestly say, in almost 27 years of marriage, we've never been in a position where I have had to call rank on my wife about a decision or moving forward. And I think it's because of this mutual love and respect that we have for one another. And what I thought was a big deal 20 some years ago, like we got to get this figured out, it's not a big deal when we're on the same page with the relationship and how we want to treat and love one another. It doesn't matter. Again, the conversation is bigger. It's elevated. It's starting from a different place. Not who makes the final decision, but how do we do this together out of love and I'll use the word in this context, out of submission to one another here, not, well, I will be the one that ultimately decides and
The buck stops here.
right, exactly.
Well, okay, I don't have to give you props with your actual language, but I will give you props because you took the lead to have the discussion. Whether she was looking for you to do that or not, it could be debated. But the fact that you, as a husband, respected her enough, respected the marriage enough to bring this topic up, who knows? But God could tell you in heaven one day. But it may be the fact that you just took that step, set the foundation for the rest of the 27 years, so you didn't have to pull the trump card. I think that's possible. And I want to go ahead and reference here something that, again, I know we're going to eventually say, so let's say it now. You and I have watched an episode, excuse me, not an episode. A church service is an episode on YouTube you can watch. That's a joke. We watched a sermon by Tim Mackie on this topic.
Yep.
And he had it, and we'll put that in the show notes, the YouTube link. And he had a very clear visual of what you just said about being submissive to one another.
Yeah.
It's not rocket science, but when you see it drawn out, what that actually looks like, and he's talking about what the scripture means of a husband loving their wife to the point of being willing to die for them like Christ did, for the church. So the mutual back and forth, that he described it as a dance, that mutual back and forth submission to one another. You illustrated that by starting the dance, you might say, with Kristen. And I'm going to guess that in the last 27 years, there's been a lot of back and forth in the dance.
That's right.
So there's another way to start the conversation, initiate the conversation, husbands, is maybe you just start the conversation. What does submitting to one another look like? Because that's mentioned in Ephesians 5 as well, right?
That's right.
So what does that look like? How are we doing with that? And give her the space, be vulnerable enough, husbands, to give her the space to really say where she feels like it is. And listen to that and, do the dance about, all right, if it's not going as it should, am I going to humble myself enough, submit in this conversation about where we are?
I know I'm amped up. I'm still a little amped up.
I meant to look for my fire extinguisher, but I didn't think about that till you started talking.
Usually I'm pretty regulated and even keel, but I told you going in that I got some
You did.
words on
You
this
warned me.
one.
Yeah.
And I think what I've observed, partly in my own life, certainly in the community in which I have existed, and in broader context, like these Facebook discussions, posts, what I see is this, what seems to me like an attitude of, yes, I get that I have to lay down my life for her, but she needs to go first in submitting to my authority as the man and as the husband. And it's like, again, we're having the wrong conversation and starting from the wrong space. That message that Mackie you found from Mackie was phenomenal, in that what he's talking about is how the marriage is a reflection of how Jesus, or how the Father is interacting with us. And who went first in that situation? Was it in Jesus's best interest to endure the desert, to endure the garden the night before crucifixion, to go through the crucifixion? Or was that in our best interest? Who went first? Arguably, Jesus was dying on the cross even before God breathed life into humanity. That was how it was going to go down. Who went first in that situation? And what was the motive? How did he lead? It wasn't from a place of authority or seeking to get submission from those that were to follow him. It was from a place of love and service.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that word authority makes me think of two different points here. One being what Mackie, I think, described quite well of the context of first century Christian life and the patriarchy that was in place, and what that really meant, the language that Paul used there, what that really means. I'm not going to repeat it. Go watch the video. But I think it's helpful for anyone who's stuck in that for whatever reason. Be vulnerable and ask yourself, all right, Mark and John, I hear you. Maybe I need to learn or grow in understanding what this really means, and putting yourself in a position of learning here, not just regurgitating what you've heard from a pastor.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll give this is my second thought, just to be, I think, to give a really good illustration of the possibilities of what can happen in your family because of what happens at the church, at the pastoral level. If you're not familiar with the podcast, The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, that's not for everybody, I promise you. But it's the story, just to give you a subplot line here, so to speak. It's the story of the mega church in Seattle that Pastor Mark Driscoll founded. And the podcast series covers basically the history of the church, and gives explanation, I should put it that way, gives explanation of why when he left, the church literally shut down. And one of the key threads that is told over and over and over was the teaching about women, their role in marriage, their role in life, really. And the stories that you hear of the people that were on staff, the families that were volunteer leaders, in the church, the stories you hear, particularly episode 5 of the series, I think it's entitled "What We Do to Women." If you go hard down this authority lane, it's going to take you to a place where women are abused. Let's just be honest. It's going to take you to a place where women are abused. And you might like, John, I'm not abusing my wife. Well, maybe not physically when you think of, a term of abuse. But if you were to ask her emotionally how she's doing, you might be surprised. And this is where I'm going to encourage, if this is touching a nerve, to encourage you to be vulnerable and be willing to put your life down for her and ask her, where she is in this whole topic, because your marriage is at stake. And if we think down the future line here, your son's marriage is at stake as well, because they're watching this.
That's right.
And so if you want your marriage to, odds are, if you're listening to this and you're like, this is really touching a nerve too bad, if you were to give your marriage a ranking, it's probably not a 10. So if you want that ranking to go up, this is possibly a conversation that should happen. And the ramifications, not unlike Mark, back to your story, the ramifications of that conversation 27 years ago, you can't, guarantee what that was. But I'm going to give if I were to put money on it and God could tell me I'm right or wrong, I'm going to put money down that your son who's married right now has the benefit of that conversation that happened 27 years ago.
Hey, gentlemen, just a quick pause to let you know about an upcoming opportunity I'm really excited about. I'm looking for 6 to 8 guys who want to really grow as fathers, to level up their fathering game. Now, this isn't going to be a Bible study or a dive into the latest parenting philosophy fad. This is about becoming better fathers by becoming better men. Now, I realize this is not for everyone, but it is for you if you want to transform, if you want to get to something real and really accelerate your growth as a father. It's for you if you want to show up at your best for your kids. This group will kick off in January, and there's a lot more information to come, but all I'm asking right now is that you let me know that you're interested. If this sounds like something you're interested in or what you need right now to be the father that you want to be, then head on out to the website, thenextmanup.com/dad group. You can find that link in the show notes as well, thenextmanup.com/dad group, and just sign up. Just tell me you're interested, and there'll be more information to come. Okay, back to the conversation. I think one of the things that gets me so fired up about this topic is what could be for marriages that is not because the husband is pulling the authority card.
Yep.
So our marriage has ebbed and flowed, but I can't think of a time where I've had to say our marriage is not really good right now. Sometimes the circumstances of life mean it doesn't feel good. Mm-hmm. But man, I got a good wife and I've got a good marriage. And I look at what could be for guys, what they're missing out on as they're beating their chest and saying, I'm right and I'm the authority. There's a family that we're connected to in our sphere. And from the outside looking in, I can see some of these tendencies where we hear comments from one side that imply there is this hierarchical structure to the relationship. And then we hear comments from another side lamenting what isn't there, And I'm like, it doesn't have to be. It could be so much better. But somebody's going to have to be willing to change. Somebody's going to have to be willing to be vulnerable. Somebody's going to have to, and let me be clear, guys, we need to be the one to take that first step. Whether that's apologize or it's invite some feedback and criticism, ask, like you said, how are you doing? How are you doing emotionally? Engage in a conversation. Be curious. Unlearn some of the nasty stuff that we've picked up with probably good intentions, just misinterpretation or misunderstanding that has become this theological straitjacket that we wear. Like there's all kinds for as many guys as there are scenarios and stories. But things ain't going to change unless we take a step forward. And I think that's part of what we're getting at here is what is it going to take for you as the husband to show some Jesus-like leadership here and go first?
So what you just described as far as the husband and the wife conversation and not acknowledging where they may be and so forth, I would not have had a reason to know and think about this without having listened to the Rise and Fall podcast. The reality is that many couples are just trying their best to live out what they've been taught.
Mm.
And they find themselves in the place, probably as silos, that we don't know why this doesn't feel right or this isn't working. And they don't know how to talk about it, or they're afraid to talk about it because out of guilt, but this is the way it's supposed to be. This is what I've been taught. This is how my pastor has described it. And if I don't do that, then what does that say about me as a wife and as a follower of Jesus and as a husband? All of that stuff is going on. And when I listen to those, particularly the women talking about that space that they found themselves, not just as a wife, but as a follower of Christ, geez, please give them the space to deal with all of those questions. And if you can't give that to them as their husband, they're going to go somewhere. Let's be real. They're going to go somewhere, or they're going to be really, really suppressed and go to some depressed kind of location emotionally. So I just wanted to say that out loud and voice that's where some couples probably find themselves and don't even know how to verbalize that. Is that fair?
It's fair. You used a word earlier in our conversation before we started recording that was curiosity. I think we suppress a lot of the questions, the curiosity that comes up because it takes us to uncomfortable places of having to get real with reconciling what I've been told, what I've learned, how I've interpreted the text myself with something else that doesn't line up with that. And the easier, more cowardly path is to ignore it. The more courageous, manly, strong path is to be willing to ask those questions, to go down that path. And maybe you come full circle back to where you are today. Or maybe you realize I'm on the wrong highway and I need to exit. I need to get off this highway and go in a different direction because this is where Father's leading me in my evolution of my own journey and my own understanding of what it means to be a man that follows Father first with Jesus as the example. Like that takes courage, especially in the churchianity context where we've been told this is the right way to believe. This is how you interpret it. And if you question that, if you show a little bit of curiosity, if you deviate, well, then what does that say about who you are, your relationship with that community, or even the bigger threat, your relationship with God? Like if you read all the stories through the sacred text we call the Holy Bible, when was God ever threatened in who he is as love and a powerful force for good, when was he ever threatened by what we brought?
Mm.
He just wasn't. He wasn't threatened. Had all the authority in the world. Every other god in human history, or just go back to the Egyptian or the Roman times, every other god had the authority and had the power and had the fear behind it that if you don't do these things, you're going to get whacked. I'm going to take you out, or I'm going to withhold the rain, or I'm going to withhold the material blessing. God comes along and says, "Hey, I'm going to do it different. And I'm going to go first, and I'm going to show you the way to be in relationship with me." I'm getting off on a tangent here. My point is this. If we're willing to follow that truth, we may find that we have to, and we're better off for, letting go of some of these other things we thought were truth, that were just interpretations that were misrepresented along the way.
Mm-hmm. I want to circle back to your illustration of observing a couple that, the hints are there. I think it could be an opportunity, certainly, that would also require courage of a man-to-man conversation. That I'm not sure how to initiate that conversation that doesn't come across as holier than thou or offensive or something, but I'm sure with proper conversation with the Holy Spirit, you could find it, or he could open the door for you. But I think in the space of a flourishing faith community, Paul does encourage us to confront one another and hold each other, hold a mirror, you might say, up to each other. So I would just encourage husbands to consider that opportunity that you have to help a brother. Some may be ready to hear it sooner than others.
Yeah.
And just understand that and think through that. But I would just encourage that, because it's possible. Oh, good grief. The ripple effect that could happen if God is urging you and the Holy Spirit's nudging you, even as I'm saying this, if the Holy Spirit's nudging you, if you follow through with his nudging and just trust him, the possibilities of what could happen because you followed his lead, that could actually save a marriage and save generations that come behind it, or prepare them, I should say, not necessarily save them, prepare them better, and give them an opportunity to actually see beauty be brought out of something that was a little tainted.
One of the questions I've asked of friends in the past, in the right context with the right relationship capital already built up, was simply, "Hey, how's your relationship going? What's your marriage like these days?" And some of that was because I had watched a couple of marriages around me crumble, and I'm like, boy, what if I'm missing an opportunity to create space to help others through their challenge and difficulty? I think maybe what blocks us up from doing that to other guys is the inability to answer it in our own lives and marriages with a strong great, or a high number on the rating scale. And so and so in addition to looking at opportunities that exist outside of your relationship, you can also turn the question back on your own. You guys know whether or not your marriage is doing well. The question is, do you want to stare at it? Do you want to address it, or continue to ignore it and avoid it? And what would it look like for a buddy of yours to intervene in your life, to ask you this question, and for you to be open and vulnerable about it. Or you initiate the conversation with a buddy you trust and say, hey man, my marriage is really not as good as I would like it to be, or it could be. And I think some of this fill in the blank could be getting in the way. What would it look like for you to take that initiative and ask for some help, to be vulnerable, and to ask better questions, to approach things from a different angle? Again, go first.
Yeah, don't wait to feel like I have it all together. Our marriage is perfect and, I don't have any work to do. Well, that's never going to happen.
Yeah.
So, just acknowledge your brokenness and wherever you are, it's okay. And, drop the facade if you're carrying one, which church-going people, let's be honest, we're perfect at carrying a facade.
That's right.
We're amazing at that.
That's right.
So what if we just did, that's just different language of what you just said, Mark, but if you're waiting to be the expert, good luck.
I will preface this next thought with the reality that the source of this has had his own recent scandal and abuse of women, basically in a long marriage, and had an affair with somebody that he was counseling. But as often is the case, there's still truth in the things that he's shared and said. And so Bruxy Cavey, a Canadian pastor that's been influential in my spiritual journey, he said this recently in a teaching that I saw. He said, wisdom plus love equals leadership. Wisdom without love is manipulation. And what I take from that in this context is Paul gives us wisdom. The text gives us wisdom, but if it doesn't come first from a place of love, just like in any other context where we lead, we're simply manipulating people to get what we want. And if that isn't enough to resonate with you as you listen to this, guys, go back to 1 Corinthians chapter 13 and just reread that. And reread it from the perspective of, how are you loving your partner? How are you loving this person that you have said yes to for the rest of your life? Or maybe, how about this? How are you living out 1 Corinthians 13 to your ex, who is the parent of your child or your children, who's the mom of your son? What does this chapter about love being patient and love being kind say to you about opportunity for you to grow? And how can you incorporate that into your guidance, your teaching, your instruction on your son, who's following your example and learning from what you say about what it looks like to be in a relationship, what it looks like to be in a romantic relationship, what it looks like to be attached to one woman in a marriage covenant? If you want a standard to go by, chances are it was even read in your wedding as part of the celebration. Go back to it and be remembered of what true love looks like. And use that as the standard by which you lead in your home. And for that matter, in any other context. John, any last thoughts? I've spoken my piece. I've shared my words. My energy level is back down to normal. So, any last thoughts before we finish this?
Yes, and I'm glad that you shared those last few thoughts, because it reminded me of a new song that I've come across maybe a month or so ago that I have not heard on the radio, I have never even heard of this group. The group is called Land of Color. And the song, I'm going to read the lyrics here because it just feels right to read them. The song is called Show Me What It Means to Love. So here's a couple of the verses. Show me what it means to love. Open up my eyes to see what I'm scared of. Show me what it means to give, what I need to sacrifice so others live. Just think about that through the husband and wife relationship. The chorus lyrics say, when everything's stripped away, the only thing that remains is the love I gave away. The love I gave away on my final day. All that will count as gain is the love I gave away. And then the last verse says, I don't want to live this life only for the sake of mine. Show me where my selfishness must go to die. Show me that I have enough. I don't need to store it up. Everything I hold tight, too tight, will turn to dust. When everything's stripped away, the only thing that remains is the love I gave away.
Guys, we're recording conversations like this because we care, because we want you to grow in health and godliness as a man, and we want you to be able to pass that on to your son. We want you to enjoy the richness of a healthy and strong and vibrant marriage relationship and relationship with your kids and relationship with Father God, who loved us before we knew of him, who went first and showed us a way, and who doesn't leave us on our own to figure it out, but walks through this with us as a guide, as a friend, and as our king. This is why we do this. I don't know who this episode was for. I don't know who this episode spoke to today, but I trust and believe that this was for somebody. And so if that is you, what can you do with what you've heard today? What does a next step leading from a place of love look like for you? And as you take that step, take the next and take the next. And at some point down the road, you'll be able to look back and see how far you've traveled into this new space of letting love lead and leading from a place of love. That's our hope for you. That's why we recorded this episode. If that's you, if this has touched you in some way, if you're pushing back and saying, Mark and John, you guys are wrong, you don't get it, feedback@thenextmanup.com is where you can engage us. And we'd love to have that conversation with you. Okay, John, thank you. Thank you for complimenting, for calming me down in spots, for engaging this from...
I didn't need the fire extinguisher. It might have been helpful, but I didn't need it.
Well, and even engaging this from a place of not necessarily firsthand experience, but wisdom from experience of life and relationships that applies inside the marriage relationship as well. Thank you for what you bring. And guys, thank you for being with us. Again, part of this community that is about being and raising healthy and godly men. All right, that's all for this episode. Same time, same channel next week. We look forward to being with you once again. Until then, adios.
To send us your comments or questions, you can email us at feedback@thenextmanup.com. The theme music is by Jacob Stanifer at Jacob Stanifer Music, and this show is part of the NRT Podcast Network.